Coming to you from the studios of AM 950, KTNF, St. Louis Park, Minneapolis, St. Paul, the progressive voice of Minnesota. This is The Gailey Show. I am your host, JP Darabagosian. We are your answer to the question, what is a queer thing I can read, watch, or go to in the Twin Cities, Minnesota, and beyond? And I am very much looking forward to sharing this week's book. It is called I'm Never Fine, Scenes and Spasms on Loss with Joseph Leza. Joseph, welcome to The Gailey Show. And I'm just realizing, did I pronounce your last name correctly?
You did. Thank you so
Okay.
much. That very few people get it right on the first shot. So good
Well,
on
with a
you.
last name like mine, usually I check in beforehand.
That's
But
fair.
welcome to the show. I just want to dive right in because when I got my copy, thank you very much for sending a copy along because I
Of
absolutely
course.
devoured your book. And you sent the most lovely, no one has ever sent me a postcard that has been as nice as yours in there. And it was so great. I was like, thank you. It meant a lot to me that I kept it and used it as the bookmark. And then I read the prologue intro, and I'm just going to read this because it has I wanted to ask you, it's going to be my first question, where you talk about the fact that the reader is not special. You are not special. And you said something about, this writer clearly doesn't know I hold the Midwest regional record for clog dancing on Lake Minnetonka in sub-zero weather. So I was like, well, clearly I hold that record in Minnetonka, which is right next door. So we're canceling this interview.
I
And then,
put
of
that
course,
in
I
there
read the
for
book.
you. So
You knew
yeah, I
ahead of
did.
time. But it is absolutely phenomenal. I mean, Joseph, what you did here is just really special. So why don't you share for our audience what your book is about?
So I'm Never Fine is a collage memoir on grief and loss. And by collage, I basically mean it consists of essays and poetry. And the essays themselves very often change form. Some of them are more traditional essays. Some are what we call hermit crab essays, which are kind of essays that mask themselves in the form of something else, like a travel log or a step-by-step guide. And some are even braided essays that kind of tell two different stories at once that are kind of interwoven with each other. But the book itself is sort of a broader look at grief and kind of, if you were to ask me to give you like an elevator pitch, it is what I like to consider to be a counter narrative in a way to a lot of the resources that are out there that people often find when they're dealing with grief or loss and they're looking for, some sort of guidance, some sort of way. And you very often encounter books or articles or what have you that, that try to sell you on this idea that grief is going to be, very neat and compartmentalized, and it's going to happen in these stages, right? And it's going to look this way, and it's going to have this natural progression. And when you're done, like you'll be back to yourself, and everything will be fine again. And my book is quite honestly the antithesis of that, because grief, I came to learn in my own experience, looked absolutely nothing like that. It is very seldom as reverent and solemn as these resources would have you believe. It's often messy. There are many mistakes. It can be funny. It can be, yes, beautiful and tragic and all of these things. And so the book itself is really just a look at my experience, both losing a loved one and the months and years that followed, and kind of presents the unvarnished truth. Doesn't really put me in a particularly positive or negative light, but it's just kind of like, here's everything that happened, the good, the bad, and the ugly.
Yeah, it really does. And would you like to share about the price? So the grief that you're experiencing is about your father being
Yes,
diagnosed with cancer. And do you want to tell us a little bit more about that relationship?
correct. So, yes, so the book chronicles, in the first two parts, I would say, chronicles my time as a caregiver for a father who was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer and, would go on to pass away. And then in the third section of the book is kind of a look at the aftermath and a lot of the sort of the questions and the reckonings that happen after that loss, questions of faith, questions of, of sexuality, questions of, memory and the relationship that you had with the person, and suppositions that you may have made that on in retrospect were completely wrong and required many years of separation for you to actually go back and look at things and realize that, the answers to some of the questions that you have were there. You just didn't see them at the time. So yes, it is about myself and my father, and losing a parent, rather early on in life. I was in my mid to late 20s when this happened.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
Mm.
Tell me a little bit more about as a aspiring essayist myself. I absolutely thrilled when I saw the Oregon Trail. Now, thrilled, I want to be mindful because you were dealing with some very,
Yeah.
obviously a very heavy topic, and I absolutely appreciated, like you said, this collage of ways that you came to exploring this grief and how you were processing it over multiple years. And so what I thought was very interesting was that you used the Oregon Trail, and I remember being so ecstatic about the Oregon Trail when I was in school. So talk to me about using things like that to get the story across that you wanted to share with the readers about how grief actually manifests in our lives.
Well, I use devices like that because, I could have taken a very sort of traditional approach to this, in the sense that I could have just given, a play-by-play account of everything that happened and made it very personal. And the book is personal. I don't want to say it's impersonal, but I felt like by doing that, it would have closed the reader out. Grief in and of itself, though we all experience it in some way, is painfully exclusive. There are obviously things that are universal when it comes to grief, but telling the story about me and my father and how I felt and what I went through would have told the reader what happened, but it wouldn't have allowed them in the way that I wanted them to. So in a lot of these pieces, I try to find those windows in. I try to find some sort of leveler that is something that the reader can recognize and hold on to and draw those parallels. So for instance, the essay you're talking about, the character, myself, the protagonist in that essay, is actively playing the game. But then as gameplay goes on, the two stories kind of blend together, because what you have both in the characters in the game and the actual character in the essay are, characters who are going through, a pretty tumultuous period, just trying to get from point A to point B without losing a person, without suffering some great loss. And so, it starts out as just gameplay, but then as the piece goes on, the two kind of converge and kind of blur, and it gets to a point where you can't even really, I hope at least, separate the two, because that is the point. It's using those inroads to give readers a way to understand not just what the character is going through, but to actually kind of give them a way to enter and place themselves in circumstances.
That's exactly how it landed for me, because when growing up as a late Xer, for those who are early millennials, I mean that game was everything, right? When you were in elementary school. But it was so fortuitous because I had literally a couple weeks before getting your book had went back online and found Oregon Trail, and it started playing it. So all of the references that you were making, it wasn't just memory, it was like recent memory. I was like, oh wow. And so it also added when I continued to play it, because I'm kind of obsessed with that game. It took on a whole new meaning for what I was thinking about while playing it. And you have one particular essay, and I don't know how much I want to get into it, because it comes at a very amazing moment, but the essay about shaving. First of all, to anybody listening right now who teaches, this essay, you need to include it in your courses, because it is absolutely phenomenal. I was about a third of the way in, I was just marveling at the craftsmanship of the essay, and then everything that you were conveying in there as well. Would you like to share a little bit about what that essay is about, because it was the crowning jewel for me?
Yes. So the essay, How to Shave Your Dying Father, literally documents um, the time when my father was in home hospice care, and it was very close to his passing. I think the events in that piece probably take place within days of him passing
Mhm.
away. And when you have elected to care for your loved one in home, you are responsible for many things, especially when they're not really able to move, or to bathe themselves or to feed themselves. And especially as a son, as a child of any parent, I don't think anybody is ever prepared to do these very intimate things, to the person who raised them, to the person who taught them how to do it. It is very, is largely out of body. It is, as I said, it is an experience that nobody prepares you for. And
Mhm.
so when I found myself having to do it and wanting to do it, because I wanted to care for my father, and I wanted to make sure that he was spending his time, his last days and hours, with as much dignity as possible. I was incredibly terrified because I'm about to take a razor to this man. I'm not a professional barber. I've never shaved anybody but myself. And so I thought, okay, well, if I'm going to write about this, if I'm going to write about the fear and the nervousness, but also use it as an opportunity to suffuse it with memory, um, I'm going to sort of, in a weird way, kind of poke fun at the fact that you can never prepare yourself for something like this. There is no step by
Mhm.
step guide for an act as solemn and scary and beautiful an act as this is. So why don't I write one? Why don't I literally just write a step by step guide as to how I did it, and how I used our relationship, and again, and memory and love and fear and everything, to find those bonds and to really show how we got through it together. You know?
It was phenomenal. It was phenomenal. And there was a letter also that towards the end that you wrote to your grandmother, so
Mm,
your dad's mom,
yeah.
that was. And I've been thinking about letters that queer kids write to family members. Now, I know this was actually in relation to your dad's illness
Mm,
and passing, but that was, I mean, the boundaries you held, there were no bars held, and the writing of that, but also you were able to kind of give space to her perspectives. What I liked about it, though, was that even when you were doing that, you held good boundaries for yourself. And you were like, I'm going to give you space for that, but that doesn't mean I'm going to give up myself, and
mhm.
trying to understand those. Can you talk a little bit about what it was like to write that letter and to include it in the collection? Because you didn't have to do that. You could have just written it and filed it away.
Yeah. I knew I had to include that. So I wrote this book. I began writing this book about 6 years separated from the event of losing my father. And so there was a great deal of time between losing and grieving and kind of revisiting and thinking about it, where I was able to revisit moments where, I may have passed rash judgments at the time when I was upset and going through something, and you're in an irrational headspace, and you see someone doing something or saying something that's not something you would do or say, and so it rubs you the wrong way, and again, you pass a judgment
Mhm.
that may be an unfair judgment. And so when I'm writing this book, I could choose to exclude a moment like that because I'm judging somebody. I'm also painting them in perhaps an unflattering light. But to remove that would be a disservice, because it was a very, it happened. I did it. And, to leave it out would probably be as unfair to me as it would be to that person. So I felt like I had to honor the person that I was 6 years prior and what happened and how I
Mhm.
felt. But I also had to leave room for what I had learned and what I had come to at least accept in my own head about those events across time. What I never wanted to do, and what I hope I didn't do in the writing of this book, was I did not write this book to create any sort of villain. I did not want to tell tales out of school because, I mean, if the book in and of itself has a thesis statement, it's that there is no wrong way to grieve. So just because I grieve a certain way doesn't mean that everybody else is going to, and their grief might look very different from mine. So I have to, again, acknowledge the things that happened as I witnessed them, but I also needed to make sure that I left enough space to offer their perspective, or at least what I believe their perspective was, so that if the reader does come away with an impression of a particular character, they do so because they had enough information to draw their own conclusions and not because I fed them something.
Well put, and all of that comes across in the book. I have to also say, you were talking about humor earlier. The funniest line I have read all year was in this book, where you and we're ditch people now. Where you're with a friend on a road trip in Italy. That's all I'm going to say, actually. And I don't even want you to comment on it, because readers, when it comes, you're going to absolutely. I laughed for. I'm
still somewhere in that ditch. Part of me never left.
Well, we've got about a minute and a half left here. Tell me, what are you working on right now? Tell me there's another book coming.
I mean, there is the idea of one. I have a work in progress. It is very much in its early stages, but I'm a creature of nonfiction, so I can say that much. It's definitely another work of nonfiction. It's definitely another essay collection. I like what I'm writing right now. As to whether or not anybody else will, and whether or not it will find a home, is, a question unto itself. But I'm following the same feeling that I felt when I was writing this one, in the sense that, all you can go by is your gut. And if you find yourself motivated to sit down and put words on paper, and nobody's telling you to do it, and you're able to summon that motivation yourself, and you're reading the words back to yourself, and you're having, you're experiencing joy as you put these words on paper, that says something. That says that there is meat to this, and that you've tapped into something, a story that perhaps needs to be told, and all I can do is follow that.
So, I hate to interrupt you. No. We're coming up on time. The book is I'm Never Fine, Scenes and Spasms on Loss. Folks, coming up next is Twin Cities Pride Amplified. We will see you next Saturday. Check us out on our social media channel for all the links to Joseph's works. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.